One of the things that we find through the Old Testament, and particularly in the prophets, every now and then there is the reminder that in spite of what is happening at the time, God will bring the Messiah. The time will come when a new king will rule over Israel in the line of David. And so, as we listen to this passage, you will see again one of these hints as Jeremiah brings it to the ear of the people. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says to the shepherds who tend my people. Because you have scattered my flock and driven them away and have not bestowed care on them, I will bestow punishment on you for the evil you have done, declares the Lord. I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them and bring them back to their pasture, where they will be fruitful and increase in number. I will place shepherds over them who will tend them, and they will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will any be missing, declares the Lord. For the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved. Israel will live in safety. This is the name by which he will be called, the Lord, our righteous Saviour. So then the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the people will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of all the countries where they have been banished. They will live in their own land. And then from the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 23. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, the rulers even sneered at him. And they said, he saved others, let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. And the soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. And there was written a notice above him which read, this is the King of the Jews. And one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other criminal rebuked him. Don't you fear God? Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be in paradise with me. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is the last Sunday in the liturgical year, Christ the King. The lectionary or the liturgical year sets out various seasons through which we move as a reminder of who we are as the people of God, the story that we are a part of. And so next Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent, and Advent, as we know, takes us up to the climax of Christmas. And then after that comes Epiphany, when the story is told of Jesus beginning to stand on the stage of history. And then we go into Lent, and we go into Easter, and then we go to Pentecost and Trinity, and then we move into what has been called ordinary time. And so there are, I think, 33 Sundays in ordinary time. But of course, all of these help us to remember who we are and what we're about, who God has called us to be. And so the climax now, on this Sunday, Christ the King, is the time when we celebrate the truth that Jesus overcame the world, that on the cross he overcame sin and death. And as Tony Campolo puts it, today is Friday, but Sunday is coming. Sunday has come. And so we celebrate the fact that Christ has overcome the world. And we have all those images, as I intimated in the prayer, of the great host of heaven around the crown, the throne rather, of Christ, who is the King. But as we come to this Sunday, I found myself wondering, how can we celebrate and consider this truth that Christ is King when we think about the state in which the world is, when we reflect on these dark days in which we live? How do we hold these two together? Christ the King, but a world that is in despair and growing darkness. I mean, we need only mention the name Trump, and then suddenly a whole story emerges. Or if we look at the Middle East, I was sent a meme, whatever that means, but anyway, little picture. And it was a picture of a drone sending out a missile. And underneath it said $70,000 for the missile, $200 million for the drone. And the people that are about to be killed have been living on less than $1 a day. What a crazy world. Week after week after week, we've been watching what's going on in Hong Kong right now, and the scepter of China wanting to impose its will. Or the climate issues, how a young lass in her teens takes a boat and rows all the way across the Atlantic. And then the man himself just walks right past her as if she is but nothing. No interest whatsoever in trying to engage in a climate crisis that is about to envelop us in a way that we've never known. Where whales lose their way because of the noise of shipping in the seas, and they can't hear each other. Where tides are rising and the likes of Venice are being flooded. That's the world we live in. But even when we think about South Africa and the time we live in, we're beginning to see hints of people caught up in state capture being brought to account. But will it happen? When you think about xenophobia and its ugly face that keeps rising onto the headlines, when we think about the crime stats, when we think of things like violence against women and children, when we have to listen to the collapse of our SOEs, etc., etc., etc. We live in dark times. And I find myself reminded of that great Methodist hymn. The earlier congregation was a little more grey than many of us here, but for those who are of that generation, do you remember the play Godspell? You remember it? Huh? And there was a song that was taken out of the Methodist hymnal, which they sang. When wilt thou save the people, O God of mercy, when? When wilt thou save the people? Not crowns and thrones, but men. You see, that's the cry, I think, of the generation in which we live. Where is this victory? Where is this hope that we speak of? If Christ is the King, why then do we live in a world such as the one we do? And as I kind of went through the passages over and over again, and particularly to the gospel passage, I found myself caught up not so much in the title on the top of the cross, the King of the Jews, but I found myself caught up in the context of the moment, namely the crucifixion and the crown of thorns. That here we are today, called to celebrate Christ the King, the gold crown. And yet the passage speaks of the crown of thorns. There is a sense, you see, in which we sit between a paradox. A crown that says Christ the King, and a crown of thorns that speaks of Christ, the Saviour of the world. The crown of gold, of course, speaks of authority. It speaks of power. It speaks of empire. And how often around us we see evidence of that. And even the ultimate abuse of power and of authority. And there is the crown of thorns. What does it symbolize? Again, it speaks of defeat, doesn't it? It speaks of mockery, of pain, and of sacrifice. And they are almost two entirely different worlds. Because the crown of thorns is something that we even shun and stay away from because it's too costly. Yes, we're called to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, but, and there's this big but, not for me, please. And so very briefly then, I want to try and make a few points about how we begin to live between these two. How do we live in the middle of this apparent paradox? Firstly, I want to suggest that history tells us that dark times are nothing new. When we look back over history, how many really dark times have the people of God not had to encounter and to find life in the midst of the darkness? I was sharing with a retreat yesterday, and we used a labyrinth. And unfortunately, many people, when they look at a labyrinth, they think of something that is not Christian. And I said, no, it has its roots in a time when the Christians could no longer make pilgrimage to Israel, to Jerusalem, because of the rise of Islam. And the doors were closed. And so they created another way of journeying to Jerusalem in order to remember what Jerusalem is about and what it symbolizes. Or those of us who have parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, who knew the 2 world wars. There have been dark times, the Depression of the 30s and all that sort of thing. Dark times are nothing new to human history. It's the nature of the world in which we live. But I think the challenges are different for us today. We are facing very different issues that stretch us, that challenge us as the followers of Jesus. We were talking in the vestry just before we came in about the levels of violence within our own society. And I've come to begin to understand why policemen and women become as short and almost inconsiderate as they are sometimes. Or why nurses in hospitals become impatient with patients who have sat in a queue since 4 o'clock in the morning. It's because of the stress and the challenges that are so much a part of the society in which we live. It's terrifying. At Epworth right now, the children's home across the hill, beginning to try and look at ways in which we can help the children begin to understand what it means to respect someone else, be they male or female. How do we integrate, if you like, a different way of looking at and treating people? How do you and I begin to do things differently? That's the nature of the society and the world in which we live. It is dark. And how often when we see a picture of someone on the news and we say, that so-and-so should be in jail right now. Eh? That's the world we live in. But secondly, I would want to remind us that the cross was not the end. Tony Campolo, today is Friday, but Sunday is coming. The resurrection, you see, helps us to remember who we are. We're a people who follow in the footsteps of the one who has overcome evil and is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And there are times when we forget that. Jesus is victor, and he wears the victor's crown. In him, through faith in Jesus, we find our hope again. And because he has overcome, we will overcome. That's the truth. And I think there are times when we forget these things because the pressure of the world, the darkness of the world overcomes us. I'm going to be referring to Leonard Cohen a little bit this morning, but one of the interesting things he says is, it is only when something is cracked that the light gets in. It is only when something is cracked that the light gets in. And you see, that's the truth that we need to continue to celebrate and remember, that yes, the vessel is dark, but there are cracks in it, and the light of Christ the King shines through. And then thirdly, in the midst of all this, we are called to be God's faithful people. We are called to be God's faithful people. To remember that he has called us. Now this is where I want to do something a little different. You know Leonard Cohen? I'm sure some of you will remember, mainly because of the Hallelujah, you know that song. Now, he wrote an interesting song just before his death. He died about 3 years ago now. And we're going to put the song up on the screen, and I want to read one, but before we do that, just a little bit of background here. Leonard Cohen is Jewish, or was Jewish by birth, but he became a man of uncanny insight into the nature of the world in which we live. And in this last song that he wrote, you hear him having a conversation with God. And it's a disillusioned conversation. He's disillusioned with God. But in the chorus, there is almost a contradiction of his disillusionment. So if you can put it up, let me read. I'm going to read it all the way through. If you're the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you're the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. Thine is the glory then, mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we kill the flame. Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name, vilified, crucified in the human frame. 1,000,000 candles burning, for they held that never came when you wanted darker. Hinene, hinene, I am ready, Lord. There's a lover in the story, but the story is still the same. There's a lullaby for suffering and a paradox of blame. But it's written in the scriptures, and it's not some idle claim. You want it darker, we kill the flame. They're lining up the prisoners and the guards are taking aim. I struggled with some demons. They were middle class and tame. I didn't know I had permission to murder and to maim. You want it darker. Hinene, hinene, I am ready, my Lord. Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name, vilified, crucified in the human frame. The 1,000,000 candles burning for the love that never came. You want it darker, we kill the flame. If you're the dealer, let me out of the game. If you're the healer, I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, mine must be the shame. You want it darker. Hinene, 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 I am ready. Now there's something interesting here. That word hinene comes from the story of Abraham and Isaac. You remember the story? Okay. Abraham was told to take his son, his only son Isaac, to take him up the mountain and to sacrifice him. And so he goes at the top of the mountain, binds up his son, puts him on the altar, raises his hand, and as he is about to plunge the knife, God says, stop. Stop. He has already wrestled with this crazy God who calls him to make the sacrifice of his only son. And it's almost as if as he stops, he says, what the hell is this about? You call me to be obedient in the world, and yet you do this kind of thing to me. And then he says, hinene. And the word means, here I am. Here I am. I am ready. We won't go into that right now. But what I'm trying to say, you see, is that when we find ourselves in this paradox, a world that is dark, that is difficult, that is frustrating, in which we cry out, God, where are you? In the celebration of Christ the King, we need to come to the place of saying, hinene, here I am. Here I am. Yes, there may be the feeling that many of the issues in this dark world in which we live are beyond us. as individuals. But there's nothing to stop us from getting together around a cause. There's nothing to stop us from highlighting a cause and for us to begin to do something that will make a difference in the lives of those who are around us. Part of that conversation earlier was to say, what, there's 1,000 police stations? No? How many police stations? And there are tenfold more churches around the country. That each of us in the communities in which we live are invited, called, challenged to pick up one issue and to begin to make a difference. So that when we work against and in spite of the darkness, and people ask, what do you think you're doing? And for us to say, but Christ is King. Christ is King. He has overcome the world, and because he has overcome the world, you and I can work with God to overcome the darkness of this world. Crown of thorns, crown of gold. We sit in the middle. Amen.